Welcome to Midweek, the weekly catch-up on tech, business and startups with me, Mike Butcher, editor-at-large of TechCrunch. At this point, I might be doing an advert about something, but I don't take advertising, so there isn't one. In the news so far this week, an independent audit commissioned by Facebook harshly criticised the company, arguing that some of its decisions were significant setbacks for civil rights. The independent audit faulted the social network for vexing and heartbreaking decisions that affect its users and potentially the November US elections. The audit criticizes Facebook's decision not to fact-check politicians, criticizes decisions to leave up inflammatory posts by, for instance, President Donald Trump, and says more must be done to stop hate and voter suppression. It's really a weekly event now here, isn't it, where Facebook has screwed up about something or other. As the US election looms, the world will be watching them even more closely, I bet. Code in the second developer beta of iOS 14, that's the thing that runs your iPhones, reveals a sudden and unannounced feature in the Wallet app that would allow payments with QR codes using Apple Pay. So, in other words, soon iPhone users will be able to pay just by zapping a QR code, just like they do in places like China, where this technology has been widely available for some time. This, of course, means that the further death of cash, which has been criticized by some as leaving out large swathes of society. Geopolitics is coming to apps and social media in the wake of the moves by India to ban Chinese apps. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the US is looking at banning TikTok and other Chinese social media apps amid rising tensions between the US and China. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my view is this. Trump sees TikTok more as a weapon for the Democrats than for his Republican voters. Thus, he wants to threaten or neuter it. So TikTok is highly unlikely to be banned. This is just the usual Trump game plan of asking for the moon in order to get his final way. But TikTok could well feel under US pressure to tweak its algorithm and dampen down anything which helps the Democrats. We will have to watch this one rather closely, I think. Speaking of China, social media firms are reacting to sweeping new national security legislation imposed by China on Hong Kong. Microsoft and Zoom have joined the pause on compliance with data requests from the Hong Kong authorities, while Apple, under pressure to act, says it's only assessing the new law. And obviously, we'll have to see whether or not social media companies will, in fact, withdraw altogether from Hong Kong. And we'll have to see whether or not Hong Kong effectively goes dark as China cracks down. Now, in tech news affecting news affecting the technology industry as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, nearly 70,000 tech startup employees worldwide have lost their jobs since March, including over 25,000 in the San Francisco region. Layoffs among tech startups reflect the economic fallout of COVID-19, and technology startups have been laying off tens of thousands of workers to cope. This has obviously hit the biggest centers, such as San Francisco, New York, but we have yet to see figures coming out of places like London, Paris, Berlin. Obviously, if they occur, they'll probably be smaller. Many startups, as we found out recently from an exclusive survey that was published on TechCrunch with Founders Forum, found that 80% of startups surveyed had gone fully remote during the pandemic, but many expect to return as a hybrid between remote and office work. So everything is still very much up in the air about whether the impact and the economic and also employee impact for startups as a result of the pandemic. Now, here's to next is our interview, which is always a tradition here on the Midweek show. It was only a couple of weeks ago that it reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius in Siberia, Russia, normally one of the coldest places on Earth. Now, clearly, climate change is having enormous effects on the planet. So what can the tech industry do about it? Well, to discuss this and other subjects is Elizabeth J. Taylor, who is founder and CEO of Waterloom and a former strategist with many Fortune 500 companies. Thanks very much for joining the Midweek show, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me, Mike. Thanks.
Fantastic. And now, before we get into it, we're all very aware of the climate as a huge issue. Where do you think things are now? What's your initial reaction to the news about Siberia hitting that record temperature recently?
I just think it fully reinforces our worst suspicions that we're not taking care of the world, and that we actually need to act quickly to not only leverage technology but also leverage policy into place. Yeah, so I think it's just, again, reaffirming our beliefs.
Do you sense, and I know that you've been a visitor to places like the World Economic Forum, where these issues are hotly discussed every year. Do you feel that there's COP meeting coming up in the next few months? Do you feel that there's anything is being moved the needle around the climate issue, or do you think that the world is effectively on hold while the pandemic is on?
I think you're right on both regards. The world is on hold in some ways, definitely, due to the pandemic, but there is such a feeling of, earlier in the year, of optimism about solving this, about gathering people together to actually focus on solving climate change and mitigating its ramifications. I do think people are still talking about, thankfully, climate change. I saw a photo of a white shark, and above it was, COVID-19, but then right behind it was this massive shark and labeling it climate change. So people understand that the pandemic will probably be around for the next few years, but climate change is something that we'll be handling for the next, amount of decades. So no, I think people are still working on the issues. There's still optimism. Yeah.
You yourself have done a lot of work in the water arena. Now, normally when thinks of water, we just get it out of the tap, of course, and forget about it. Why have you decided to concentrate on this area, and what is it about it that could be in some way subject to the innovation world?
My favorite question: why do I love water? Because it's so complex and it's so multi-layered and not easy to fix. So again, water is not just about, opening your tap water. That's part of it, but it's just layered with local politics, international agreements on how we trade our water, the technical aspect of actually getting water, of conserving it, of sanitizing it, of delivering it to agriculture in cities. And there's just so many layers. That's why I enjoy it so much. And it's so complex that it, of course, demands technology for it. All these different facets that I just named, from, sanitation to just dispensing it, locally. It all needs technology. And the water industry in general is pretty conservative. So it understands that it needs to utilize technology, but people are a bit slower to adapt, a little bit more cautious. So that's an impediment.
And tell us more about the startups you've seen working in this area.
Mm-hmm. So there's so many different types of areas startups can take part in. There's startups working in the agricultural sector. Most of our water, about 80% of our water, more or less, is utilized by these massive farms that, give us soybeans to rice to almonds. And a lot of startups work with farmers or these larger agricultural practices to optimize how they use water, how they optimize to use water using sensors and data, which is pretty interesting and very much needed. It also helps with tagging and how to identify fungus growing on different plants. So this is one area. Another area which is pretty interesting and interesting to think about is that there are companies that actually make rain. I'm sure you've heard about these rainmakers.
Right.
But yeah, there's a couple of them. One of them creates, essentially, they release negative ions into the air, and negative ions attract dust, and then dust attracts water particles, and then there you are, some rain. Other ones inject this silver iodide solution in clouds, which makes it rain. So there's very like technically deep tech solutions to water scarcity in these issues.
Do you feel that in the conversations that you had in your world, do you find that venture capitalists or other kinds of investors are getting involved in that world?
Definitely. More and more investors are understanding they have to invest in infrastructure. Because the infrastructure, our infrastructure is aging, not just water infrastructure, but we're talking about energy, food. It's having to change with population growth, with urban growth. It all has to change. And part of it is changing how we deliver our water. So investors are interested about the infrastructure, the software behind it. There was one, I had a conversation maybe a couple months ago about how a lot of our local water is actually operated very locally. So all these little water operators, how you get your water for your shower or for your drinking water, it's all operated within your little place at home. And the issue is that how can we make all these guys work together? Because it's not just we're little villages anymore. We have to work as a country. We have to think about water, maybe even beyond our country, but we have neighbors to our north or west or whatever. So we have to actually think about water in a different way in this regard. Yeah.
And the other thing I suppose also is that water is a huge issue for the developing world. Sanitation, clean water as well, of course. And of course, as climate change unfortunately progresses, places around the equator, etc., will be subject to much higher temperatures. What sort of things do you see are opportunities for innovation in those areas? Or is it just going to be just incredibly hard to mitigate some of the effects of climate change in those areas?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge simply because these places in the developing world don't have the financial resources. But what they say is necessity is the mother of invention. These particular countries are so willing to pack whatever financial resources they have into investing in better infrastructure or technology. Like, do you remember how basically Africa leapfrogged the use of like those little cheap Nokia phones, and they just went straight to smartphone? You remember this? It's kind of the same idea with water technology and with other technology that's going to mitigate climate change. Like they understand it so much because they're at the front lines. So the challenge for them though is to get the financial resources from other communities, from other countries to help them kind of build up their resources. Yeah.
And so I know that you've been working a lot in Europe. Do you see there a particular difference in strategy between the way that the business world is tackling some of these problems versus North America, versus Europe, versus Asia, for instance? Are there differences in policy regulation, differences in approach in terms of the innovation sector, perhaps?
Yes. Yeah, everybody collaborates very differently. And it also, again, depends like politically on where you stand with your neighbor. I mean, for instance, in the Middle East, you're less likely to call up your neighbor and talk about water, right? Versus, for example, in Switzerland and France, they have a water agreement. Actually, I always mess this up, but the eastern part of France is supplied by water from the Swiss Alps. So how they collaborate around water is Excel sheets and emails. Which is pretty low tech.
Really?
It's really low tech. And they have about an annual meeting once a year where they exchange information. This is it. And in the US, it's a bit, it's more decentralized. It's a nicer way to put it. But information doesn't really flow that well in nearly all countries regarding water, which is one of the things that I'm really particularly passionate about is optimizing this information exchange. But they all have their own, they have their own issues, and usually it's fundamentally rooted in politics. Yeah.
Yes, I suppose also see as climate change, as the effects play out, the climate change is just going to become a more and more of a big issue in terms of the issue of water. Obviously, what about countries like the UK, for instance, or Ireland, where water is in reasonable abundance, especially in the more northern areas, rather than other parts of the world that are more arid? I mean, should temperate climates like the UK worry that much about water? I mean, should we worry? What do you think?
I think for people in the UK and actually other parts of the developed world, really should think about their resilience network, about who's actually managing their water. That's, I think, a prime concern people can now understand with the pandemic. Before, we would say this and it's like, eyes glazed over. But essentially, one thing, if you're in the UK, to worry about is figuring out who's actually managing your water, because the likelihood that a local team is actually optimizing and managing is rather low. There's about, on average, 12-person team to manage water for 1 million people in the developed world on average. Most of the stuff, meaning like dashboards, water optimization, data analysis, that's all done in a different country, but mostly, India or the Philippines. The reason why the UK should worry that is that if something happens in India, whether it's climate change related, or maybe the government shutters their internet, which India has done in the past, not to bigger cities like Mumbai, which is where most of the big companies are, but side note. But if that were to happen, people in the UK should kind of worry and actually ask their government, their water managers, what's the backup plan if something happens over in this area. So that's one thing to really be concerned about.
So I suppose one of the overall impressions I'm getting is that the water industry is really ready for some kind of disruption in terms of the innovation that could happen. It's legacy infrastructure. You've got once-a-year meetings between governments in France and Germany to talk about water from the Alps. Surely that's going to have to change. And do you see I mean, a lot of people are talking about the pandemic accelerating the amount of digitization. Do you see that affecting the acceleration of digitization in the water sector as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's accelerating what we've been talking about for some time, which is decentralized governance, decision making, and bringing more. Like I mentioned earlier, water is a conservative industry. So they've been slow, and that's understandable due to different constraints, a lot of it financial and political, to adapt new technologies or new ways of simply working. But it is definitely ripe. And also what's nice about water industry is kind of the old guard is retiring, the people that would be a bit more conservative about trying new things like AI, for instance. So you have these new people, if you will, willing to try these things. So yeah, it's really, really, like you said, very ripe for disruption.
And finally, tell us a little bit about Waterloom and what's it up to at the moment. Does it have any next steps, new plans for this year or next?
Mm-hmm. So what we do is we work with different types of companies and organizations on water resilience. And a lot of that is based on collecting and analyzing the proper data. When I say proper data, it's not only like internal data that the company or organization has, but we're giving them context to how they can build water resilience within their own communities. So we take different data from, the environment, social, these different types of contextual data, that's what I call it, to actually paint a really better portrait of how an organization, uptakes water from a certain reservoir. Perhaps, it'd be useful to analyze different types of solvents in a lake to figure out how healthy it is. These kinds of things is what we do. So water resilience work. This next year, people always talk about water scarcity, but this year, with climate change being a huge issue and developing countries are being put more on a platform to kind of advocate for themselves and saying like, yeah, we are on the front lines of climate change. You know, we see how it's affecting our tourism industry, et cetera. So now we're really talking about, okay, what solutions can we offer developing countries, these communities, and actually building up their water resilience efforts. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's been fascinating to talk to you, and I never thought that water was going to be such a big area to discuss. I'm sure we could go on for even longer, but for now, I would say thank you very much to Elizabeth J. Taylor, who is founder and CEO of Waterloom, and we'll thank you very much for joining anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. And you'll be able to catch up with that. Obviously, this is all recorded on Periscope and cross fingers on YouTube as well now. So check that out. And if you want to check out any of the other interviews on the Midweek show, you can go to mikebutcher.me/midweek. And if you would like to get notifications about guests, upcoming guests, and whatever else is going on that I'm up to, get notified at tinyletter.com/mikebutcher. But from me, Mike Butcher, I'll be back next week, midweek. So for now, all I can say is goodbye and have a good week.